Hello, happy Friday. How has everybody's week been? I quickly Googled adoption trauma just to see what popped up and see what it might trigger. But one thing I think I mentioned before is I didn't wrap my head around the idea of adoption through from infancy, right? An adoptee that was adopted as an infant versus maybe through the foster care system, that that their trauma would be that there would be really such trauma, right? Or maybe as big. And I've come to learn a whole lot, and I've come to realize that indeed there is a lot of trauma no matter when you're adopted for the adoptee. And I also know that there's a lot of trauma for the birth mom. And I also think that there can be, for many adoptive parents and hopeful adoptive parents, trauma that we went through as well to get to this point. And so I found this thing that I pulled up that talked about some issues that arise. That they're particularly talking about the adopted child, but I think it could pertain to anyone. And I just wanted to go through them. The first one being loss, which I think is an obvious one, right? So for birth moms, it's the loss of a child, that they have made the important decision, the hard decision, the excruciating decision to place. And for the adoptee, it's a great loss as well, the loss of their birth parents. And for the hopeful adoptive parent, speaking personally through my own infertility journey, a lot of people have, I felt a loss of being able to have my own biological child. And I know a lot of people that we work with have been through miscarriage or, losing a child. In fact, recently we had one of our families unfortunately experienced a match where the birth mom lost the baby. So loss is a really big one. And these are things we have to recognize if we're going to adopt. These things, this trauma is part of all of our story. The next one was rejection. Much like the feeling of loss, rejection is also related to loss. And certainly it's easy to understand that for an adoptee, the rejection of being, unchosen is a word that they use, which is interesting. It says that they were once the unchosen before they were chosen. I felt a huge rejection. I felt a big rejection in that my body rejected me. I remember feeling, and I know somewhere I used the words that my body rejected me. And for a birth mom or an expectant mom, there's a lot of rejection around that decision from people around her. As you can imagine, lots of people have opinions and want to interject their ideas of what you're doing, your personal decisions, and I can only imagine it in the world of an expectant mom or a birth mom. Guilt and shame, the feelings of rejection may lead to guilt or shame. Thinking that from the adoptee's perspective, they may begin to think that something is wrong with them to have been adopted. It might be hard for your child to not feel like they did something wrong, that this was their fate, right? The feeling of guilt and shame. I just heard a sermon actually by one of my past clients who's a pastor and who was, of all things, speaking at one of the synagogues in my area about how, as a pastor who was maybe a little bit more played things close to the vest when it came to private, when it came to her own life, people didn't know that she was struggling with infertility, but constantly saying, when are you going to add to our church family? When are you going to bring children into the world? When are you going to bring children into the world? And this feeling of, well, I don't know exactly, but I can only imagine that there was a bit of a sense of guilt or shame that it wasn't happening really fast, that all these people had these expectations of her, perhaps feeling shame that she could not do that. People thought she should or could. And certainly for a birth mom, it's very easy to understand the guilt and the shame piece of it. And I'm sure that is something that never goes away. Perhaps maybe through open adoption, it's something that she can come to peace with, but I'm sure that plays a big piece of it. Grief says this may come in different times in your child's life. Many adoptees are not fully able to understand the impact of their loss until they're adults and able to understand more. And it says without being able to process their loss, they will not be able to fully grieve for their situation either, which is interesting because when it comes to birth moms, there's this idea that we talk about that a birth mom needs to be able to say hello before she can say goodbye. And that's what that reminds me of. And grief for us as adoptive parents, not being able to, I certainly grieved not being pregnant, not experiencing that, not experiencing childbirth. Oh, I still get caught off guard sometimes, how it comes back to me. Grief of, as a single mom too, there's a whole bunch there, but grief of, not experiencing all the things that we dreamed about, right? Maybe for many of us, we dream about what our children will look like, who they'll be like, what their mannerisms will be. And we think about that in terms of our own biological children. I now have all those same dreams for my son, but it's different. So grief. Identity, huge when it comes to children through adoption. Your child may have issues identifying who they are and what their identity is, depending on if you have an open adoption or not. Certainly with an open adoption, it's way easier for the child as far as how much information is there. Maybe it's identity for a birth mom in this word mother and where they fit in, or identity. I just heard a podcast of a man talking about the word mother versus parent when talking about their biological or their adoptive parent who raised them. And he was talking about his struggle with the identity between the two and the titles of which to give each one, which I thought was really interesting. It was an interesting conversation to hear. Identity for the hopeful parent, I guess in somewhat of the same way, it's interesting. As I'm reading these for the first time, I'm like, okay, what's coming up for me? And what's coming up for me is this idea that when I hear people talking about their parent either as an adoptee or just in the adoption community, we all feel this need to put this disclaimer of adoptive parent, the word adoptive before, instead of just saying parent. It's something that still triggers me a little bit sometimes. And, my child is young and I've never heard him say that. That's not to say he won't, he's still very young too, but especially when telling their story, I guess that's the way to distinguish between who you are talking about. When you're telling your adoption story and you say parent, people may get confused. So maybe that's where identity comes in with the parent, with the adoptive parent, with the hopeful parent. Intimacy, that's interesting. Your child may have issues in relationships with members of the opposite sex as they begin to age and learn more about biology and reproduction. Ooh, that's happening for my son this year. 5th grade is the big year. Make sure to have age-appropriate discussions with your child about this. Intimacy. I'm single. I can only imagine with couples, but I don't know. I'd imagine that if you are having problems with infertility, it could get in the way of your intimacy with your spouse. I know our children may have problems with intimacy and getting too close with someone in fear that they will leave. And I don't know about birth parents, how to bring in that, if anybody has ideas. And then the last one is control or mastery. Your child may relate to issues of control because they may feel they were not part of the decision to be adopted in the first place. They had no control and now they want it. This can trigger power struggles with parents and their adopted children. Be aware that this may occur as your child gets older and questions more and more of their inability to control situations. That was a big thing in the Primal Wound, the book that I'm reading right now that I talked about before. So control or mastery, or I'm going to put the word power in there too, comes to mind. And certainly we can all relate, especially as you're going through the adoption process, this transfer of power between the hopeful parent and the birth parent, right? Where during pregnancy, the birth parent may feel like, or we may feel like, there's a little bit of control there, whereas the minute that she places her baby, she feels a lack of control, and maybe we feel more of that power. Each of us comes to the table with our own story. And I think what's important here, and what I really want to express, is that we need, when we say the word trauma, sometimes we're thinking about it only as in terms of one person in the triad. And yet I think we really need to provide space for these things to relate to everybody in the constellation of adoption when we talk about trauma. This absolutely plays a role in all of our parts, and we have to leave space for that. One doesn't trump the other. It's all of our lived experiences, and we need to make space for it, and we need to not judge it, and we need to respect it. There's a lot of disrespect in this community, and it makes me so sad. Not one person speaks for every member of the adoption constellation. Please remember that as you are joining communities, as you're trying to learn. When you learn from one person, that's their experience, that's their opinion. So take it to heart and listen and take it in and see what resonates for you, and then maybe dig a little deeper. Ask questions. Keep following. Try to understand it. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll continue this conversation again as we always do every Friday, so tune in and get your notifications. Have a wonderful weekend, you guys. Mwah. Bye.